Hello, everyone.
Hello, everybody. I think we're good to start, or do we want to wait a little bit longer for people to trickle in?
Let's wait, give them 2 more minutes.
All right, so we'll get started in about 2 more minutes.
How do you guys feel about chat? I feel like I'm having, oh, you're recording now?
Yep.
I'm having such a hard time like answering people's questions. I don't know why. It could be a million things. Ooh, is that the mask?
Yep,
I like
this
how it matches
is
your shirt.
the mask we're going to be making today. It's got a little pipe cleaner in the top part of it, help fit it to your face. This will probably impede being able to hear me, but look
No,
something like that on.
Good.
Oh, good. Maybe I'll just leave this on the whole time then. Model it.
I'm having a hard time with the mask too. People usually can't even hear me when I'm not wearing a mask. And so now it's like even harder.
I think we could probably go ahead and get started.
Great, awesome. So, hi everyone, my name's Tom. I am a library associate for Arlington County's Makerspace, The Shop. Here helping me out today is the Maker team lead, Caitlin Atanasio. She will be providing tech support. So before we get started making these awesome cloth masks that we've prepared today, I just want to go over a few things. The first is that we're going to ask you all to turn off your video and to turn off your microphones for the duration of the program. The second is that you all should be aware that we are going to be recording the program. So that means that if there's something that you miss that you want to go over, we will be uploading them and they'll be in the future available to view on the library website, which is really cool. And I believe that's it. Am I forgetting anything, Caitlin?
I just wanted to mention, if you have any questions, you can either use the chat function or the Q&A function. Either one should be fine. We'll stop as we go through to give the opportunity to ask questions, but feel free to ask them as they come up. I'll be monitoring that and answering any questions that you might have.
Great, awesome. So with that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a closer look at the mask we're making today. It's a pleated mask, and this top strip of bias tape here has some pipe cleaner sewn into it. And it's actually pretty easy to make. I realize this is a pretty good project if you are just a beginner. That being said, I'm going to give you guys also a little tour of the space we're going to be using today. So, right. Over here, my desk, we are repurposing currently for a sewing station. This will probably be the last station that you use. The first one over here is going to be ironing. We're gonna iron our fabric before we cut it, just to make sure that what we're measuring is consistent with what we need. And then over here, we have our cutting station. Now, I've also laid out most of the materials that you're going to need today over here. So I'll review them when we come back here, but for now, in order to do this project, you're going to need a pair of fabric scissors, something to measure. Here I have a quilting ruler. You are going to need pipe cleaner. You're going to need bias tape, and later we'll go into exactly what that is, but If you want to just search for bias tape, there'll be a lot of results that come up. And then I have a Sharpie here, but if you don't want something that is going to be permanent on your fabric, feel free to use fabric markers, tailor's chalk, anything you feel confident that it's not going to stay on your fabric after a wash or two. I've even used pencil before. But that being said, we're going to get started at our ironing station. We're just going to jump into it. So today I've picked this blue fabric for really one main reason, and that is it's basically a typical cotton blend, which is perfect for what we're trying to make. It's affordable, and one thing I really like about it, especially if you're a beginner, is that both of the sides look the same. So that's really going to be helpful, so that if you sew something on the wrong side, it doesn't really matter because it'll look the same anyway. And here I also have another fabric, and this is just kind of to illustrate a bit of vocabulary for you guys. So in sewing, we have these terms for the right side of the fabric, which is this side. This is generally the side of the fabric that's going to be facing out on your design. And it's going to be the one with the more saturated colors typically. And then on the other side, you'll see that the less saturated side, we call this the wrong side of the fabric. So you'll probably hear me referencing the right and the wrong side of the fabric a couple times throughout this presentation. So just so you guys are caught up, that's what that means. The difference between the sides is really just how they apply the ink to the fabric. There's no structural difference or anything to the fabrics. So we are just going to start ironing our fabric. And something interesting that a lot of people, maybe they know about sort of ironing, or maybe they don't know, but I think it's a good point to bring up, is that there is a difference in the terms ironing versus pressing. So what we're doing here is we're ironing, and you can tell that because my iron is kind of just gliding over the fabric versus pressing, because pressing typically is when you have a seam that you want to make sure is stable and strong. So ironing it and having the iron doing this gliding motion is going to affect the integrity of the strength of your seam. So if you're ever pressing open any seams, which we actually don't need to do for this project, but I think it's still good to know, pressing is basically you'll put the tip of your iron on the seam with your steam on to kind of split it down the middle or to one side. And you'll normally see that if you're following a pattern that you've found, they may differentiate as well between pressing and ironing. So that was quick. We have our fabric ironed. Another note that I'll make is that before we even started the program today, what I've done already to pre-treat our fabric is, again, because this is just a normal cotton blend, I've thrown it in just the wash with my normal clothes and sort of just dried them all together. And basically the reason for that is then when I go to wash my mask later on, any shrinking that was going to happen when using this fabric has already happened. So it kind of prevents things from bunching up later on. But now we're going to move on to our cutting station. And Caitlin mentioned this earlier. about in the middle of the program, pretty much after this step, when we go to thread our machines, that's going to be an opportunity for, if you're putting in Q's that you need A's for, questions, we'll be able to answer it then. And then also any questions you have after the program. Now, you'll notice here, I was making a lot of masks, so I made this template for my mask pattern. And this is just something I made out of cardboard because it's more durable than using tracing paper or wax paper or even regular paper as a pattern. But if you are doing this at home, this is just a 7 by 9 inch rectangle. So if you want to make your own, feel free to. Now, we're going to take our fabric, and just to save us a little bit of time, because we need 2 pieces, we're just going to fold it over. And it doesn't have to be perfectly folded for it to come out correctly, but you kind of want it to be approximately like a good fold where all the lines are meeting up, just so that, you know, everything's consistent. Again, I'm taking a Sharpie and I'm going to basically trace around these 3 sides of my fabric. If your fabric's being wonky for some reason, or you don't have the selvage edge that you want to do it against, you can always just cut right in the middle of your fabric. I try and do this because it also saves fabric. But if you don't have selvage edge, or you don't like this edge, then you can certainly put it in the middle. Just, you'll have a couple strips that you won't be able to use. Again, you won't want to use a Sharpie, but for a program, it's very visible, which is why I like to use it. We're just tracing around. And I guess you guys are going to see me making this pattern without the selvage edge, because I said I was going to put it along the edge, and then I totally didn't. So we're going to waste a little bit of fabric, and that's totally okay. But this is also a good opportunity while I'm cutting this out to tell you guys, this is my cutting mat. It's great for if you're going to be using a rotary cutter. I'm not going to be today because I've never really gotten the hang of these, but they're supposedly really good for like cutting in a straight line, and you can do it very quickly. I just never have taken the time and don't have the patience to get accustomed to using the old pizza cutter. So
rotary cutters are also great if you're doing quilting and you have quilting rulers.
Yes, that's what we have here. Again, is a quilting ruler, another really useful tool, especially with quilting, where, you know, the measurements are so important. It's great because it's transparent. You can sort of see everything that's happening under the fabric so that nothing is accidentally getting bunched or what have you. But a couple of things is take this opportunity while I'm cutting out my fabric to talk a little bit more about bias tape, because if you do not have bias tape, you can actually make your own from scrap fabric that you have. And there's videos online for how to do that specifically, but just to explain a little bit what bias is. Bias, and true bias specifically, is basically when you cut the fabric at a 45-degree angle. And when I say 45-degree angle, this is relative to basically the grid that makes up your fabric. Because when we talk about fabric, there's 2 different kinds. or generally, there's like two big categories of fabric, which are knits versus woven fabrics. So for today's sewing project, and if you're like making a button-down shirt or something, you're going to be using a woven fabric. And basically that's where it's kind of like a grid. And that's where the fabric kind of finds its strength, versus knits where everything's held together by a series of loops. Generally knits will be stretchier. However, when you cut something on its bias or its true bias, you will also have some stretch, which is really good for what we're making today, because we're gonna want some stretch, as the bias tape we use is also going to act as the straps for our masks. So yeah, this is kind of a closer look at bias tape. You can see it has a little bit of stretch to it. And now, before we move on to do our first set of stitches, I also want to show you, these are the pipe cleaners that we pulled. They're about 5 inches in length, and then we kind of just bent the ends of them inward. And that seems like a small detail, but it's actually really important, because if you forget to do that, your pipe cleaner will burst or poke through the bias tape, and then you might be poking somebody in the face, which is probably not your intention. But let's move on now to our sewing station. So as I adjust my camera angle for this so that you guys can get a really good view of how I thread my sewing machine, this is kind of that moment for anybody who has a question so far. I can kind of answer that now if there's any of that.
I don't think we have any so far.
Great, right? So since we don't have any, I'm just going to make sure that angle is good here. And you guys be sure to let me know if you don't have a good view of something. Now, something to mention too before we get started with this part is that every model, every brand of sewing machine is a little bit different, but there will generally be some similar things. For instance, you'll probably have a spool holder, and you'll probably have some little grids. Mine has little gray numbers, and those are directions kind of for threading your machine. But since every machine's a little bit different, you're really going to want to use your manual that came with your machine as a reference. Now, again, normally I'd be using the spool holder for my thread, but because I've been making a lot of these masks, I'm actually going to be using this big spool of thread. And I'm using red just because it's going to be hopefully a contrasting color to the bias tape we're using, which is green, so it'll be easier for you to see. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to thread our bobbin. So what is a bobbin, you may be asking? Let me tell you. Looks like my cat may have knocked off my bobbin, which was here a second ago. So let me just grab another one real quick. Hold on 1 second, I'm just gonna grab a bobbin. And basically bobbin is what's going to hold your thread that goes on the bottom side of your fabric. So that's easy to remember. bottom bobbin. And for my machine, again, yours may be different. The way it wants us to thread it for the bobbin is up through this slot and around the middle bar, and then around this spherical cylinder shape here. And again, I know this because I've looked at my manual, and I also have, they're really faded because they're the same color as the machine, but right here, there's actually directions similar to the gray marks that are for the upper thread, but that are directions for the bobbin. Now, once we have gotten to this point threading wise, we're going to take our bobbin, and you can kind of see how it has these little holes. So you actually want to take your thread and push it so it's coming out of the hole through the top. So I'm just going to do that real quick, and then I'll make sure it's really clear. Right. So yeah, it is coming out through the top. And then we're just gonna put it over here. And something you do not want to forget is then click it to the right. Otherwise, your machine may think that it is still sewing normally when in fact it is winding a bobbin. So at this point, once you've clicked that to the side, next part's really easy. You just have to push on your foot pedal, and it is threading. Now, we're actually going to be doing some pretty long stitches when we get to basically sealing the bias tape around the mask. So you're gonna wanna wind yours pretty full just to be safe. I cannot tell you how many times I have wasted so much time because I was in the middle of sewing and I thought I was doing such a great job. I was, you know, on a roll. It was just gliding through, and then it turns out that my bobbin thread was empty, and basically none of my stitches stuck. So yeah, see, it kind of stops when it gets full. Click it to the left again, so you're out of bobbin winding mode. And I'm just gonna grab some scissors, pull it out, and release. Now again, inserting the bobbin may be slightly different for your machine. Let me just bring this down a hair. But basically, a lot of the new machines make it pretty easy. You just use this black lever here, and it pops the cap off, and then you have your bobbin case. Now, for me, it wants the thread to be going around the bobbin counterclockwise. So with the thread like this, you're just gonna insert it, still holding onto the thread. You want to go to the right, and then to the left. And basically what I'm doing is I'm leaving my thread so that it's going away from me, but then I am also making sure that, if you can see, there's a metal bar right here. So the purpose of going right and then left is so that it hooks around that bar, because that's what's gonna hold it in place until the needle grabs it. So otherwise, that's it for the bobbin. You can just put the plastic cap back on and that guy is good to go. It is good to mention that a lot of people have side bobbins where it's kind of on the side of the machine. They're still essentially the same. Again, you're just going to want to hold on to that manual. And my cat is now going to be assisting us, apparently, as we thread the top part of our machine. So we're going to take our thread, which we kind of just left from when we wound our bobbin. And now, as opposed to following the set of white instructions, which we had before, we are going to follow the dark gray marks on our machine. So for me, that's just going down through here. And see here, it's got the little symbol for 4 for step 4. Gonna come up. We see step 5 here at the top. That just comes around. And now we're going to get into super close-up challenge mode of sewing. Because sometimes these tinier parts are hard to see. But basically right here, where my finger is a little metal bar. And you're just gonna put your thread behind that. Like so, easy breezy. There goes all my stuff, thanks cat. But yeah, so at this point, you can stop if you want and just thread your needle like you would normally. However, a lot of machines do have these automatic threaders, and I'm gonna show you how to use that real quick. So basically this triangular shape, you're going to want to bring your fabric over and then under that hook, right? And then you'll notice that I am bringing the thread to my right. And the reason for that is basically you're going to want it somewhere in front of the eye of the needle. Because basically the way this mechanism works is that you press down on the gray lever and it brings these teeth out in front, and that's just kind of to help you guide your fabric. And then believe it or not, in the very, very middle of those teeth is a tiny little hook that goes through your needle. So once I've gotten to this point, I also hold my thread up a little bit just to ensure that when it comes out, it has grabbed my thread. So then I just release it, and you'll notice the tiny little hook grabbed my thread, and I can just pull it the rest of the way through. Now again, you can just thread it normally at that point, but if you're interested on using your automatic needle threader, you are free to. Now, here I have my fabric, and if you want at this point to just ensure that everything stays in place, you can pin your fabric sides together, or alternatively, you can also use clips. These are like sewing clips, but really you don't need these. You can just use binder clips, they work the same. Or if you want to be daring and risky like me, I'm just gonna sew and go for it. Now, before we get started on this part, I have my machine set to just a standard straight stitch. The markings on your machine with the little measurements, most machines have this, these little grid lines here. Those are measurements from your needle if it is in the center of your presser foot. You'll notice that there are some other straight stitch settings for like either the left side of the foot or the right side, but the measurements are accurate to center. Now, for every stitch that you do in your life, if you want it to be secure, you're going to want to stitch and then back stitch. So basically what that looks like is my presser foot is down. I use this lever over here to bring it down, up, down. And To keep my measurements consistent, I'm lining the edge of my fabric up with the edge of my foot. And you're gonna do 3 stitches forward. So I'm just putting my foot on the pedal, going 1, 2, 3. That's actually 4, but that's fine. And then on my machine, there's a little button here. It looks like a U-turn sign, and that's for back stitching. So every sew you do in your life, you're gonna wanna start and end with 3 stitches forward and 3 stitches back. So now that we've seen what that kind of could look like on your machine, we'll go 3 stitches back, 1, 2, 3. And at this point, you can sew like normally until you're done. So we're just gonna do 1 seam here, and we're basically going down the short edge of our fabric. And then now that we're at the end of our stitch, we are going to do 3 stitches backwards again. And basically what this does is it just secures the stitch really tight. And you don't have to do what I'm doing, but I'm a little superstitious, so I just do an extra 3 stitches to tie everything off. Now that button I just pressed, I don't know why it has a turtle, but basically this brings your needle to the upright position and basically finishes off your stitch. You want your needle to be at the highest point before you remove fabric, just to ensure that, you know, your needle's not still in the fabric. Also, you can just use scissors here, but often my machine has like a little blade on the side that can also just trim threads. So I'm gonna do that. Just gonna trim my threads anyway, because we always want to do that. Now, when you trim your threads, you actually don't want to go all the way to where you backstitched, because that will actually, you know, give itself to those stitches coming undone later. And we don't want that to happen. So we want to give a little bit of a tail, just a little bit. And now we're going to do the other side. So again, your pinned fabric or your Daredevil not pinned fabric under the presser foot. 1, 2, 3, and then backstitch. 1, 2, 3. Now, believe it or not, I actually have a background in theater. That is what I went to college for. So that is kind of why I know so much about sewing now, is because they would have me work in the costume shop and the prop shop. So obviously costumes, making costumes and garments, and in props, we would do like the coverings of furniture pieces. So hopefully if you do have questions, I'll be able to answer them with that little bit of experience. But we also just did 2 straight stitches. If this is your first time sewing, congratulations. You have completed your first couple of stitches. And now that we've done that, we are going to move on to our iron. Back to the ironing station. So also, if you're wondering about these gross stains here, they're actually like not anything bad. That is what happens when you accidentally spill water on your ironing board. And I missed a couple threads, give me 1 second. And then you put your hot iron on the water. So if you don't like those stains, do not try and iron on top of water. So now you're going to take your fabric. You are going to turn it right side out. Again, keeping in mind wrong side and right side of fabrics for what we just did. If you were sewing, you want your wrong sides to be on the outside when you sew. And then when you turn it inside out, it will look correct. But our fabric looks the same on both sides, so it doesn't matter. And just check, you can see, we're just ironing down. And That's good. I'll do the other seam. Now again, going back to pressing seams, as I mentioned earlier, the reason we're not doing that right now is because you see, because of the way that our fabric is going to lay in its end position, pressing those seams open we would just then press them shut again when we get to this point, which is why we didn't do it. Now, once you've done this, you are going to fold your fabric so that the bottom and top edge touch. And that's your fabric in half. You're gonna iron it down so you get a nice crease. And then bring one edge in. And you're basically bringing the edge into that crease you just made. So basically you have a crease at every third of the mask. And now you're going to do that to the bottom portion too. Cool, awesome. Now I like to do this at my ironing station just because I like the muslin in case I accidentally am stabbing stuff with pins. But now you'll want to take your bias tape from before, and when you cut your bias tape, I cut it to basically 48 inches. So 48 inches of bias tape, and then you are going to pin or clip your bias tape to your mask so that basically it stays in place until you can sew it down. So here's my bias tape. That's the basically folding it over itself so I can find out where center is and kind of basically estimating where the middle of the mask is. If it's not perfectly centered, it's not a big deal, but remember we did a 9x7 rectangle as our pattern. So taking in about a 1/4 inch from each side for our seams, it's 8.5 inches divided by 2, you can find center if you want to be exact about it, but I'm not exact about it. Right. Awesome. That's one side, flip it over. Now, if you notice, I'm opening my bias tape so that if I were to unfold it, it would be on top of the mask. Because basically, when we're towards the final steps of it, we're going to be sewing it so that it curls up and around. And that's actually another common use for bias tape, outside of them being, you know, really utilitarian just for like straps or cords or any sort of tie, is that they're really useful for seams, because unless you are using an overlock stitch like on a serger, your seams basically are going to want to fray after a bit of time. So if you don't want that to happen, what you can do is you can sew some bias tape over your seams, and that gives you a nice clean finished edge. And I've even seen people who like will use it as a design choice for like the scoop of a neck in a shirt. They'll finish off the neck with bias tape. Just makes it look pretty clean. And got our last clip in here, and going back to the sewing machine. And before we get started sewing, the next thing I'm going to do is just grab my pipe cleaner from before and have it on hand. Now, if you notice, I had 2 earlier. That was just because I was doing a test run. You only need 1, and that's going to be for the top of your mask. Now, at this point, the design is symmetrical, so you can choose either side to be the top of your mask right now. And make sure your thread is going away from you. Placing your bias tape underneath. Again, I'm not actually a huge fan of these clips, but they do the job. I just take one off right away because they get bulky and I don't want it to be in the way of my needle. So 3 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 3 back, 1, 2, 3, forward. And here you have 2 options. You can either use the edge of your presser foot like we did last time, or you can even follow, there'll be like a crease in your bias tape, and that is also a good guideline. And we're almost getting to the edge of our fabric, so we're going to do a couple more stitches, and 3 stitches back, 3 stitches forward because I'm superstitious, and bring that needle up and cut off that thread. Yay! So we have 1 strip of bias tape that's secured. Off camera, I'm just clipping my threads. I feel like a good rule of thumb for your tails is about 1/4 inch. And now we're going to do the other side. Right. Move that clip out of the way. Same with that guy. And just line everything up with our hands. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Let's say 4. Why not? And bring it through. Goodbye, our last clip. Right, and 3 stitches back, 3 stitches forward, and we're good. So now it's really starting to look like a mask. Clip your threads, and then we are going to move on to the next step. So now, whichever side you've chosen to be your top is the one we're going to work on next. And really, the only difference between them is one is going to have a pipe cleaner in it. So I'm just taking my bias tape. The open side is here. It's going to be on the left side. But what I'm going to do first, just to begin to close it, is I'm going to do our 3 stitches forward, 3 stitches back, and this is kind of a way to do it if you want one continuous seam. But if you're not confident about that, you can also just do 2 separate seams. It's not a big deal. And I'm just going over it a couple times just to make sure it's super secure. Now what I'm going to do, which is what you want to do when you're sewing corners, is you're going to lift the presser foot up while the needle is still down. And then you're just going to turn it, and lo and behold, you are ready to keep sewing, and you're going to be sewing at that beautiful right angle. Notice the folded edge of my bias tape is aligned with the presser foot. So we still have that mark of, to kind of keep us sewing straight as we go. Right. And now that you're here, what you're gonna do is just start lining everything up. And so you can kind of see this right angle between the fabric and the bias tape. And I like to go a little bit in before, but you want to start thinking about like, where's the middle of my mask? And let me put my pipe cleaner in there a little bit. So now we're going to just keep going. And if you're really nervous, some people switch to a zipper foot. I don't think it's necessary. I haven't had an issue so far. But basically a zipper foot just has like a little scoop that basically is the room for the zipper. But pipe cleaners are so thin that you really don't need it. Now, I'm just going to keep sewing until I'm about where my pipe cleaner is, and turning it again, bring the presser foot back down. I'm going to sew a couple stitches forward, sew back, and then bring it back around. And basically what that's done, actually let me do one more back stitch, is that his securing my pipe cleaner in place so that when I throw it in the wash, it doesn't move around a ton. If you want, you can also sew on either side of where your pipe cleaner is if you're nervous about sewing over pipe cleaner. Worst it'll do is dull your needle a little bit. Right. Now that you've done that, you can just sew to the other end of your bias tape. Right. Then lift the presser foot up, back down. 1, 2, 3. Back, 1, 2, 3. Needle up, clip your threads, and get ready to do the other side. And we are literally doing the exact same thing, but with no pipe cleaner, so it's even easier. And remember, the open side of your bias tape is facing the top for this first moment. 1, 2, 3, let's say 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Looks like I went over my bias tape, which is fine. I just want to make sure I'm on the fabric for when we do the long stitches. Just adjusting my mask. A good point to make sure that you have that like nice 90-degree angle here between your fabric and your bias tape. I'm just tucking everything in as I go. And if your stitches aren't perfectly straight, that is okay. As long as it's sealed, as long as you're hitting every layer of fabric, it may not be the prettiest thing, but it works. I think I see a question about the length of bias tape, and I'm using a length of 48 inches for my bias tape, but you can probably use as much as 54 inches. Any more than that, and I feel like it gets in the way. Yay! Clip your threads. Woo! All right. Pushing your thread away from you. I'm getting out my clips again. And now you're going to want to take the side with the pipe cleaner, which is the top of your mask. And my rule of thumb, just so I keep my masks consistent, is I take that crease and I fold it up to that first seam for the first pleat, kind of. So crease to that first seam, and then I'm just going to clip it like that so that it holds. You want them to be, you know, about equidistant, but if it's not perfect, it will still be an effective mask. There we go. And I always feel crazy every time I use these clips because I feel like they take so long to put on. And then the first thing I do is take them off when I go to sew. And now basically what I'm doing for this second pleat is I'm taking the next crease and I'm kind of going halfway to the next one. Right. Same for this next pleat, kind of halfway up. And then clipping it. And again, really, binder clips do the exact same thing, those little alligator clips. All right. There we go. Cool. So, like I said, this part drives me crazy because then I just immediately take out the clip. And then I start up here just because I think it looks better aesthetically to have one seam going from the top all the way to the bottom. So starting at the top, and do 1, 2, 3, backstitch 1, 2, 3, and then taking the clips out as I go. And now, basically, you just want to make sure that the little feet that are underneath your presser foot are grabbing the layers of fabric as you go. Because if you notice, when you put fabric through your sewing machine, it kind of naturally pulls the fabric through. So we just want to make sure that it continues to do that as we go through multiple layers, and we can still use the edge of our presser foot as a guideline. And back. And forward for good luck. And clip your threads. Awesome. And now switch to the other side. Right. And just adjusting. 3 stitches forward, 3 stitches back, and sew in normal. Oh, so it looks like my thread came undone, which is happening because while it's a pretty good solution for using a large spool, my spool is just kind of hanging out in a mug. So if that ever happens to you though, just bring your needle up, pull it out, and you see it never even did those first few stitches, which is perfect. So I don't have to worry about trying to continue a seam. And I'm just going to rethread my machine the same way we did the first time. And just get used to threading your machine because this is something that happens pretty often. Ah, there goes my mask. Pull it through, under the presser foot, and away from you. All right. Do. Bye, Clippy. Also, if you ever hear your machine making a really loud clicking sound, it's no big deal. It'll start to do this about every 8 hours of sewing or so, and it just means that you've built up some lint in your machine because every time you stab the fabric and you stab that thread, you'll probably graze a thread every once in a while. And with that, I'm going to clip your threads. Clip, clip, and clip, clip. Smack your sewing machine for good luck. And that is pretty much it. I'm going to turn this around. Hi. So now you got your pleated mask. Top here is your pipe cleaner. That's how we know which side's the top. And you can just wrap it around. The pipe cleaner really does help it just kind of form to the shape of your face. And again, because we are using bias tape, we can be confident that like these strap edges aren't gonna fray. Nothing bad's gonna happen.
The pipe cleaner, or you can use floral wire too, is also very helpful if you wear glasses, so that you can form it. Let me turn on the video. So that you can form it right over the bridge of your nose and sort of tuck it underneath your glasses, and that way your glasses don't fog up when you're wearing your mask. It's very helpful for that.
Good tip for all those glasses wearers out there. But that's basically it. You've made your mask successfully. Now that we're at the end of it, I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
Really quick, we just had a question if we can post the instructions
yeah,
with measurements and such.
Absolutely. So we can post the instructions for this. And again, this program is being recorded. So if you want to go back and watch it, that should be available at some point soon too. So
thing I wanted to mention is I know a lot of people are making masks a lot at a time, and I wanted to see if you have any tips and tricks that you can share with folks who are making more than one mask at a time.
Oh yeah, I've made a mask or two in my day at this point. So I'll use my other fabric as an example. But basically, one thing that has saved me a ton of time when making masks, if you're like trying to do a whole family at once or whatever the reason is, folding your fabric over just like we did for our pieces, but doing it multiple times. So basically each fold is gonna compound. So that's one mask. Folding it again is 2 masks, 4 masks, or 8 pieces total when you do it again. So doing stuff like that so that you're doing all of your cutting at once and then you're done is really helpful. Basically a workflow like an assembly line. So you want to do all of your cutting at once while you have all the equipment out. You're going to want to do all of your ironing at once, all of your sewing at once. And then not only is that more efficient, but it's also helpful if you don't have a huge place, because then the little stations that I've set up, you only have to have one station out at a time. So when you're done ironing, you can put the iron away. But yeah, that's the main advice I would have. And then also like, if you're doing like a ton of masks, those big spools of thread, you saw it kind of like got itself unthreaded from my machine for a second. Still totally worth it because those like little spools will run out so quickly. And yeah, otherwise, I do think that like if you are doing like bulk masks, it's actually a great way to get really familiar with your sewing machine really quickly. And one thing that's kind of come from this for me is I'm just like, now I feel like I am so familiar with the straight stitch and most things are a straight stitch that like, I'm just like, what project is next? Give it to me. So that would be my advice though, in summary.
Did anyone else have questions that they hadn't had a chance to ask yet? Feel free to use the chat for that. Well, we'll hang out here for a couple more minutes, I think, but for those who are good, thank you so much for coming. Tom, did you have any parting words?
Not much. Thank you guys for your patience as this is our second virtual program and I've been so excited about them. I'd also say if you really enjoyed it, we're going to be having Intro to Sewing again. We're also going to be having other virtual programs coming up. And if you want to keep up with the other stuff that we're doing, you can follow us on Instagram at apl.makertom. So yeah.
So it looks like the question is, can you go over the folding of the pleats again?
Yeah. Actually, I learned a trick recently, and since I'm next to my kitchen, let me just grab a fork. But yeah, this is a trick I kind of saw online recently that I thought was pretty clever. I'm not super picky about the like distance between my pleats or that they're all the same width or whatever, but one thing that I did see is that if you just take a fork into your fabric, you can like do this at your sewing machine, and then as you sew, just turn it over, and then you have like a consistent pleat every time you sew, which is one way to do it. Otherwise, for this mask specifically, after you've made those creases from ironing, remember we folded it in half and then we ironed it for a crease that went down the center of your mask. and then we folded the ends in to meet that crease. So we had a crease at every third. So basically, in my mind, the fold should be in between the creases, right in the middle. So if a crease is at every 1/3 of the mask, then the fold of the pleat will be at every 1/6, I guess.
I think
that's
it's
how that
actually every
works. 1/9? Oh, 1/4.
quarter.
There we go.
So there's 3 folds, but it separates it into 4 quarters.
Yeah. So another great reason to either grab some measuring tape or one of those rulers if you're bad at math like me. So.
Great. Well, if there aren't any more questions, as I said in the chat, if you have any questions that come up, you can email us at lib-makers@arlingtonva.us. Or you can always, Tom gave out his Instagram that you can send him messages on there. Gabby and I are also on the library's Twitter, so feel free to send us any questions on there as well.
Yay.
Great.
Awesome.
So thank you all so much for attending.
Yeah, thanks for coming. See you next time.